How to explain that some titles, although highly regarded, never crossed the Japanese borders? One of the reasons is that they were developed too late in the console's lifecycle, and their sales potential was not recognized by Western publishers. It's true that in 1994, gamers were bombarded with more enticing information about 32-bit consoles. Ghost Chaser DENSEI exemplifies this phenomenon. Published by Banpresto and developed by the small team at Winky Soft, this port of Djinjen Makai, released just a few weeks before the Saturn and the PS1, later experienced a surge in popularity as strong as the indifference it had previously shown. A belated recognition justified by its inherent qualities, which prompted Banpresto to produce a sequel, unfortunately exclusive to the arcade. To discuss this no longer hidden gem, I am joined by Régis, owner of the retro game shop and a video game tester in his spare time. Hello Régis. How's it going, Guillaume? I'm good, and you? I happen to be in the neighborhood and was thinking, should we test Ghost Chaser DENSEI? Let's do it. It's right here. Hello, everyone. I'm joined by my friend Régis. Hello, I'm very happy to make this video with you. Thank you for welcoming me to this store, the most organized one in all of Paris, a legendary shop. Whatever people might think, it's one of the oldest shops in Paris. There may be older shops, but we were among the first to embrace retro and focus solely on retro gaming back in 2005. Thanks for taking the time to test Ghost Chaser DENSEI, which is this. A magnificent copy. Did you sell this one? Yes, I sold it, and it's going to Brian. Let's give him a shout out, he has great taste. I think you do too. We're on the same page there. To provide some context, did you know this game? Yes, I was familiar with this game because I imported it a long time ago, probably in the early 2000s, from Japan. I used to go there regularly for the store, and it was a game that wasn't very common. It was already considered rare. However, it was an inexpensive game that we had to sell in France. I can't recall the exact price, but it was between 30 and 50 euros, much cheaper. I'm talking about the period between 2005 and 2010, and not many people knew about it. Maybe it's still relatively unknown today. I would say it experienced a phase of hype, thanks to our fellow YouTubers who highlighted it, and that's great. However, personally, back in the 2000s, I wasn't aware of it. It's based on an arcade game. I mentioned it in the introduction, but not everyone knew it from the arcade. Not everyone knew about this title, especially in France. It must be quite rare in France. One more question, related to your work, is it a title that's in demand? Does it sell easily? It's a title that's rarely seen, so that's one aspect sorted. However, I did bring it in earlier this year, and it sold immediately to a customer who was looking for it and couldn't find it. I got another copy and sold it within a month. I would say it sells well due to its rarity. I think there are people looking for it who can't find it easily. And it's still a very good game in my opinion. Good or very good, everyone has their own opinion, but it's also a valuable collector's item. That's the paradox. It was relatively unknown, but I believe it has now reached classic status for the Super Famicom. It frequently appears in top lists, whereas 10 years ago, we only knew the classics. It has definitely achieved a status, and perhaps it's justified. The story, very quickly. The story in beat-em-up games is generally of good quality. We're in the year 2279, and chaos reigns. I'm not sure if you were aware. Organized crime is growing rapidly. To restore peace, the government deploys the Ghost Chaser unit, a team of 3 fighters. What does that inspire in you? It inspires me that I'm in a 90s beat 'em up. The story doesn't set a very high bar, but we quickly want to jump in and start fighting. There are 3 playable characters, although there were 6 in the arcade version. Perhaps it was due to technical limitations or memory constraints. We have a somewhat standard character, Makai, somewhat like Cody. He's well balanced but not particularly strong in any specific area. Then we have a girl named Io, a sort of Catwoman who resembles Guy, very fast but less powerful. And there's the big brute represented by a robot that looks like nothing but stands out from the other 3 due to its strength. First question I'm going to ask you. Let's get into the details. What did you think about the graphics and technical execution spontaneously? Visually, it's not very advanced. It's not ugly by any means, but I'd say it's somewhat mid-range. It's not bad, but it could have been better. However, I do find the animation good, quite smooth. There isn't much lag. I still find it enjoyable to play, even though it has some flaws, which we'll discuss later, but graphically, it's not top-notch. It's not ugly either, somewhat in between, and technically quite successful. For 1994, one might have expected better. 1994 wasn't the beginning of the console era. Nonetheless, it's pleasing to the eye. I did note that the pixel art, and I might be a bit more critical here, is somewhat coarse. It lacks finesse. I find that the characters and their representation, the backgrounds are at times a bit dull, and in a way, it's reminiscent of Neiketsu Oyako, almost veering into bad taste. At times, if you know what I mean, it's a bit too Sentai. Neiketsu Oyako on Saturn or PlayStation, exactly. It's a nice game but not very well known, perhaps a bit more now, but still not widely known. Even less known than this one, I think. I call it Sentai, the superhero stuff, etc. Exactly. I like it, it has its charm, but at times, it's a bit kitschy. Yes. I'd call it kitsch, a bit kitsch. Maybe not bad taste, but very kitschy. Yes, sometimes it's a bit much. We agree on that. Overall, I've noted this. It's a charming title, in terms of graphics, there's no issue. Now, how about the sound? Do you even remember the music themes? What did you think? For me, from that perspective, it didn't stand out. I find it fairly average. It gets the job done, but it's not something that will stick in your head. That's my feeling. I didn't find it to be fantastic either. It's a bit generic, which is quite harsh, but the game does have its merits, we'll get to that. But it's fairly run-of-the-mill. On the other hand, the sound effects do convey the power of the hits. It does remind me a bit of Ninja Warriors again. Yes, the character and the sound effects. I forgot to mention it, but it's also in the graphics. There's clearly an inspiration. Indeed, the 3 characters somewhat resemble Natsume's title and the basic characters. I don't know if they copied it, but it could be a coincidence. Now, let's talk about gameplay. I'll try to explain how it works a bit before I let you speak. We have 2 basic buttons, one for attacks, one for jumping, and by pressing both simultaneously, we execute a special attack. In the options, you can configure it to assign the special attack to a different button, which is quite convenient. There are 2 bars, one for health and one for special moves. There are special moves, and we'll come to the moves because you confirmed it. The move set is quite impressive. I think that's one of the main strengths that makes the game memorable for people and sets it apart from other beat-em-ups. And the fact that there is a learning curve in mastering its gameplay. We have blocking, which isn't always the case, and counterattacks. You press in the direction of the enemy at the moment they strike you. In 1994, for a beat-em-up, that wasn't very common. It's a highly evolved beat-em-up. There's a back attack, a running attack. Now it's the norm, but back then, I know that games like Streets of Rage 3 and Final Fight 3 were out, but it was still quite rare. You can attack on the ground, perform juggles, execute special moves, and there are quite a few of those. There are a lot of them. Honestly, there are many. My feeling, however, is that they're not easy to execute right from the start, and in the end, we tend to resort to the typical beat-em-up moves like jumping kicks, punches, and grapples. You really need to invest some time to discover the moves and enjoy them more. I find them not very intuitive. I agree with you on that. But when you do pull them off, it's quite satisfying. It's paradoxical because it's both a flaw, the barrier to entry is not negligible. I agree with you spontaneously, you don't feel like using them right away. To quickly explain, most special moves are executed by pressing the guard button and performing combinations like left, right or down, up. The thing is that you're often surrounded by enemies. When you want to charge your attack, because you can charge your attack to make it more powerful, you need to be on the move all the time. You can charge your attack by standing still, but that's a risky move. Essentially, you can't do anything. Otherwise, you were saying it packs a punch. Exactly. What I find, however, is that this extensive move set, that's what makes the game rich. Initially, we may play more simply, more fundamentally, and then, we'll strive to discover the moves and enjoy it more. I find there's a progression in the game's appeal and the enjoyment it provides. It's really its richness. This is where it stands out from others. Because beat-em-ups, as we discussed earlier, are generally quite basic, but at least in terms of gameplay, this one offers a lot to delve into. The three characters are genuinely different to play. I find this more pronounced than in other games. Second point, the two-player mode. We didn't play it much, it's true, but you should know that there are a lot of combinations to try when playing with two players. You can grab your partner and throw them at enemies. You can even perform special group attacks, which isn't very common. It reminds me a bit of Turtles in Time, inevitably, at least the part where you grab and throw at enemies. But it's not very common in this genre of games. In that respect, they made an effort, they designed the game to be played with two players. That's quite commendable. Next, what do you think of the enemies? Unfortunately, I found them a bit too redundant. We'll probably hear that it's typical for the genre, but given that the game is very good, it's somewhat disappointing. I share your view. It's a bit disappointing to keep encountering the same enemies. You'd expect some variety. The bosses, on the other hand, are interesting. There's progression there. I find them somewhat unique. In that sense, I didn't keep thinking of other games each time. However, yes, the characters you encounter throughout the stages are a bit repetitive. But indeed, it's a common aspect of the genre. It's true that it doesn't match the gameplay variety and moveset. It's a shame. I did notice, though. You might not notice it immediately, but the enemies are visually the same, but they evolve over time. For example, there are the obese enemies. They remind me of Fist of the North Star. Exactly. In the early levels, they're standard. Later on, they start flying or shooting laser beams. There was still some effort put into it. But let's say graphically, it's still the same. I also noted level design. I'm going to sound quite negative, but I have to emphasize the shortcomings. I find it a bit flat in terms of pace, lacking in changes. It's pretty much the same sequences, especially because there are only 4 enemies on screen. If I criticized it, I'd say that the Super Famicom can't display more. Without lag. No, not without lag. In that case, it would slow down, whereas the game is smooth. Your observation is quite valid, I think. There are 5 levels. We'll get to the game's length. The length of the game, there are only 5 levels. That's a little too short, it's true. It would have been nice, given that there's 1 level less compared to the arcade version, just so you know. Nevertheless, they are quite lengthy, sometimes a bit too long in my opinion. But let's say it would have been nice if they added more environments. That's it, you say it's too long. Yes, because the pace isn't fast enough. It could have been the same length if there were more diverse backgrounds or things to keep it interesting, perhaps new enemies, and again, in the level design. I'm not asking for platforming sequences. Of course, it remains a beat-em-up, but let's say it's still linear. Oh yes, there is one phase, the famous elevator phase, a classic but also a bit too long, and then there's the final boss, which, unfortunately, I find to be way too difficult. Overall, it's not an extremely difficult game, you progress without too much trouble. However, even the penultimate boss, the last boss, brace yourselves, you're in for a tough battle, but that's part of the game, too. It's to make sure you don't finish your game too quickly, especially when it costs a bit. That's a good point when it's not an affordable purchase. What else can we say about this title? The question I wanted to ask is, if a customer was hesitant to buy it, what argument would you use to convince them to get it? Firstly, it's a beautiful item. Yes, the cover is magnificent. It has a very anime feel. Let's be honest, nowadays, when we buy these games, it's also about the item. It's not just for playing, even though both aspects are important. The idea is that the game is rich in terms of gameplay. Just for that reason, I think it's worth it. There's progression and a decent lifespan, especially with 2 players. It's worth mentioning that the 2-player aspect is a big plus, indeed. And let's be honest, if we compare it a bit, yes, there are a few beat-em-ups on the Super Famicom, but there aren't 100 different ones to compare, and I think it's one of the best. In my opinion, it can easily be placed in a top 5. I don't know all the beat-em-ups. Let's be cautious and say it's in the top 10. Be cautious. When I said it's between good and very good depending on personal taste, it's a game to have in your collection, especially if you're a collector. Otherwise, you can find the cartridge loose. That can also do the trick. To conclude, I would say that those who knew it back then were probably few in number. And I think they were pleasantly surprised because it was entirely unknown. Honestly, I find that it's on par with the best games in the genre. It seems to be a genuinely interesting title, especially if you're looking to collect because it's still budget sensitive to have in your collection. Thank you, Régis, and thank you to you. With pleasure. I hope we'll meet again. I think we'll do more with pleasure, especially those you knew back in the day. Maybe some of your cherished ones. Of course, there are a few. Thank you, and see you soon.